Bava Metzia, Daf Pei Zayin. We're starting with a little bit from Pei Zayin and Pei Tes, Amud Aleph and Amud Beis. Salt and fire. Pועל mahu שיהבהב באור. In this fascinating piece of Gemara, we will understand a nuance in the wording of the Rambam by a careful reading of the Baal HaMaor as a revolutionary way of understanding the Gemara. And from that we'll get some insight into a Kabbalistic idea of the Ramban in Chumash. And from that we'll understand something of what's happening in the world today. All of that in less than 20 minutes in Mitzvah Hashem. So we start with a posuk in Parshas Ki Tetzeh. Ki tavo v'kerem re'echa v'achalta anavim kenafshecha sav'echa ve'el kelyecha lo titen. While you are busy plucking the grapes in your friend's vineyard, you're working for your friend and you're plucking his grapes, you can eat the grapes as much as you want, and our sugyas deal with exactly what stage of the production does this apply to, but you can't take home, you can't take for your family, you can eat while you're working. From the word anavim, the Gemara learns on the bottom of Pei Zayin Amud Bet, anavim velo anavim v'davar acher. Only grapes. If you're in the vineyard, you can eat grapes. But you can't add anything to the grapes. Says Rashi, what kind of thing might you be adding? You might want to salt the grapes a little bit. Salt does wonders for any fruit, even for a sweet fruit like grapes. They make chocolate with salt on. Who would think that you put salt on chocolate? But it's delicious. That's what salt does. But that you can't do. Says Rashi, you can't salt the grapes, making them more delicious than they are naturally. And that's going to bring you to eat more. So you can't flavor them any further than they're naturally flavored, because that would encourage you to eat more than you would normally eat, which is more than the Torah allows you to take from the Baal HaBayit. There are two issues going on in the sugya here. The one is taking something from the Baal HaBayit that you're not supposed to take, taking something from the owner. How much are you entitled to take? How much are you not entitled to take? What's that boundary line? And the other questions of Meiser, that the person who's eating the fruit while he's working doesn't have to take meiser. So we have to be very careful that he's doing what he's allowed to do. He's eating the fruit that the Torah gave him, and not anything more than that. If he's eating something that the owner gives him, then it becomes chayiv b'meiser. He has to take meiser on that. So there are two different issues. There's hilchot meiser and there's hilchot schirut, the laws of a poel, a worker being hired, and they blend into the same sugya in this piece of Gemara. But we're focusing primarily on the relationship to the Baal HaBayit. The Gemara then asks the question on Pei Tet Amud Aleph, our daf, Pועל mahu sheyehavhev באור v'yochal. What then if he wants to singe the grapes? The Gemara has said that the Pועל is allowed to work the whole vineyard and eat from the section of the vineyard that gets a lot of sun, so he's eating the best grapes, but he's allowed to do that. But can you apply heat to the grapes and improve them that way and eat them? He's making them delicious. Is that like anavim v'davar acher? Mi havik anavim v'davar acher or lo? Is this the same as adding flavor to the grapes and thereby by making them more delicious and thereby resulting in eating more than you would otherwise? Or is this not the same? Why is it not the same? Because you're not adding anything. The grapes are the same grapes. You've just processed them a little bit. So the Gemara goes through various different proofs backwards and forwards and brings a brisa that the poalim are allowed to eat and so on, and then says, Befitam lo yochlu, they shouldn't eat it together with bread, ela im ken natu reshut mibal habayit, velo yispot b'melach v'yochal, and he shouldn't dip the produce into salt and eat it salted. Melach vadaika anavim v'davar acher dami. Isn't that because salt is like adding something else to it? And therefore explains Rashi, v'af agav da'alayu da'anavim ka mevadele, even though you're putting salt on the grape, v'lav milta ba'api nafshihu sofet, and he's not really adding a different ingredient, mikol makom davar acherhu. Nevertheless, that's considered something else. You're using an external flavoring agent, the salt, and that's called davar acher. That's anavim v'davar acher, anavim plus, and you're not allowed to have anavim plus. Aval mahavhev e'malacha deshari, but just to singe them and to add a bit of heat to them, maybe there's nothing wrong with that at all. The Rif paskins the halacha and says v'lo anavim v'davar acher. You're not allowed to add anything else to the grapes. And then he brings the Gemara. What about singeing it with a flame? So the Gemara goes on to say, he can't take time off to singe the grapes. That the Gemara itself discusses and says that he certainly can't, because then he would be robbing his employer of time. So he can't go and singe the grapes. But what happens if his wife is there and she says, just pass me the grapes, I'll singe them for you. So he doesn't take any time. He's just singeing them. What is the din then? Says the Rif, v'lo ifshit, and this is not resolved. Are you allowed to or not? We know that that anavim with davar acher you can't do. Anavim with something else you can't do. Anavim with salt, grapes with salt is like something else. But what about a flame? V'lo ifshit, not resolved. Hilkach lo yehavev lo, and therefore even if he's not stealing from the balabait, he's not stealing time from the employer, he still should not do it. That's how the Rif ends with the halacha. V'lo yispot b'melach v'yochal dahavaleke anavim v'davar acher. So we have three cases that we're dealing with. We're dealing with grapes plus other flavoring. You put sugar on, you put cinnamon onto the grapes. Definitely not allowed. Grapes plus salt, says the Rif, also not allowed. It's the same as adding something else. No difference if it's salt or it's sugar or it's cinnamon. What about a flame? Processing it with heat, we're not sure, and therefore you shouldn't do it. That's how the Rif paskins, and the Rambam goes in his way, as he usually does, but a slight difference in wording which alerts us to something going on. The Rambam says he shouldn't eat the grapes with an additional additive, and not with bread, and not with salt. But the Rif has just said salt is salt is something else. Salt is another ingredient. So once the Rambam has said that includes salt. You don't have to mention salt separately. Why does he do that? So clearly I might have thought that even though you can't eat grapes with another ingredient, so sugar on the grapes would not be okay, or on the berries, or on the wheat, whatever it is that you're harvesting. I might have thought, but salt maybe would be okay. What's the difference? The difference is that other flavorings add and blend flavor into the food. Salt doesn't. When you've added salt, if you taste the salt, you failed, you've put too much in. The idea of salt is to enhance the flavor of the product, not to add flavor to the product. Other spices and herbs that you add, they add and you blend different flavors together to create the final flavor. And a person who's already, what the Gemara calls in chuli and a kfela, somebody who's a master at taste, can actually pick out and say, I can do, like the labels at the back of the wine bottles. It has this flavor and this and hints of that and hints of this. So an expert can do that. But salt, you don't taste the salt. It just enhances the flavor of the object, and therefore I might think that salt is different. This that the Torah says, anavim v'achalta anavim kenafshecha, only grapes and only grapes. But if you've salted the grapes, you're still only enjoying the grape, you're not enjoying anything additional to the grape. Comes the Rambam to tell you, based on our Gemara and on the Rif, v'lo b'melach, you can't put salt in at all. This difference between salt and other flavorings is so significant that the Baal HaMaor, and we don't have time to go into this brilliant Baal HaMaor who learns the sugya different from all the other Rishonim. You remember the Baal HaMaor was a talmid of Rabbi Avram ben Yitzchok Av Beis Din. That's the second Raavad. There were three Raavids. There's the second Raavad, is Rabbi Avram ben Yitzchok Av Beis Din, who was the Av Beis Din in Provence. And there's the Raavad, who's the third Raavad, the Raavad that we know who was a talmid of his, and the Baal HaMaor was a friend of the Raavad, talmid of Rabbi Avram Av Beis Din in Provence. And he wrote the Baal HaMaor, questioning and analyzing the Rif in a way similar to how Tosfos questions and analyzes the Gemara. On this Rif, he learns the Gemara in a revolutionary way, where he holds that Rava, that we have in the next piece, discards everything that's gone before, and Rava has a new approach, which we take l'halacha. What emerges from the Baal HaMaor is that fire and salt are the same. Davar acher is different. So he classifies it altogether differently. Davar acher, if you add sugar or cinnamon, that's no good. It says anavim, you're only allowed to eat grapes. If you add fire, you're just processing. You're not adding anything. It's just heat. still the same thing. The fact that you're making it more delicious, but that's the same grape, the same as you can eat the grapes that come from the sunny part of the vineyard, so you can add a bit of flame to the grapes and heat the grapes a little bit to bring out the flavor. Nothing wrong with that. And salt is like fire. So, other sugar and cinnamon, no. Fire, yes. Salt, others say salt is like davar acher. The Rif and the Rambam say salt is like davar acher. Salt is like sugar and cinnamon. And the Baal HaMaor says no, salt is like fire. And just as salt is mutar, certainly fire is mutar. It comes out completely differently from the other poskim. I just want to go into the parallel between the salt and the fire, because that emerges. You see it already in the Rambam, hinted at in the Rambam conceptually, but it's clear in the way the Baal HaMaor emerges from the sugi that salt and fire are parallel. What's unique about fire? Firstly, yes, you're not adding to it, you're processing. That's very important. You're processing the grape or the wheat or whatever it is. It can be any product. And fire is so interesting because fire is so destructive. Fire is one of the most destructive forces we have in the world. And yet we can't eat without fire. Fire applied appropriately to process food enhances the food. Fire in the wrong place destroys. And you leave your food too long on the barbecue and it's inedible, it's burnt. It's got to be just right. With fire, it has to be just right. If it's just right, it's beautiful. You have a wonderful meal. If it's not just right, it messes up the meal. That's what fire is. And salt is the same. You put in too much salt, it messes up the meal. You've got to throw the food out. It's inedible. Put in too little food, the salt in, the food doesn't have flavor. And salt is also a destructive force in the world. Salt also causes destruction and corrosion. So that understanding of salt is like fire gives us an understanding into salt, which I want to apply to the posuk in Vayikro, and we've got the same in Parshas Korach. V'chol korban minchatcha b'melach timlach v'lo tashpit melach brit elokecho me'al minchatecha. Always have salt on mizbeach, and that's why we have salt on the table. Why salt? Hashem needs his food to be salted and spiced. And what about other herbs and spices? No, just salt. You want salt on the thing, on the mizbeach. And the Ramban brings a view that it's just to show to treat the korban as you would treat your guests at home. If you have an important guest, you'll put salt on the food. Do the same to Hashem. Not that Hashem needs that, but the way we present the food to Hashem. And then the Ramban goes off in a different direction, which we'll see. And in Parshas Korach, the same, when the Torah talks about the deal with the Kohanim, that the Kohanim get truma, Brit Melach Olam Hi, this is an eternal Brit of salt. What is this Brit of salt? What is the salt, and why is it so important? The Ramban hints at it, but it's really the Rabbeinu Bechaya who expands on it a bit. The Ramban just says, V'hinei, he notices firstly that in Brit, Melech Brit Elokecha, it doesn't say Hashem Elokecha. In all the parish of the Korbanos, the word Hashem is there. Here it's Elokecha, he notices. God the judge. What's the Brit got to do with that? And then he says, Hinei Brit Klula Mikol HaMidot. The Brit combines different midot. For a Brit to work, for a covenant to work, there've got to be different elements of ethic in the Brit. And he says, salt gives taste and flavor, it preserves, and it destroys. That's what a Brit does, the same. And he doesn't really explain it much further than that. Further on he says, Ki abrit melach ha'olam. A Brit is the salt of the earth. We have that phrase in English, salt of the earth, but we talk about a person. The Ramban says a Brit is salt of the earth. Bo yitkayem ve'yikaret. The world both is preserved and destroyed through the power of Brit, and that's like salt. The Rabbeinu Bechaya, just above, explains it in a little bit more clarity. Salt has fire and water in it, because you take seawater and you apply heat, you apply sunlight to it, and the heat of the sun evaporates the water and you're left with the salt. So salt is made from water and fire. Water is like the midah of rachamim. It sustains the world. It's kind to the world. Fire is like midat hadin. It's harsh and it can be destructive. And in melach, you've got both. Salt is created by applying heat to water. מטעם זה אמר ולא תשבית מלך בברית אלוקיך, קרא ברית אלוקיך מלך לפי שבו יתקיים ויקראת העולם. It sustains the world and it can destroy the world. Rabbi Bechaya again in Parshas Korach speaks in the same vein. V'hinei zeh davar v'hipucho. You've got to understand that salt contains within it its opposite. Ha'echad kalul b'chaveiro. But it's not that it sometimes destroys and it sometimes sustains and preserves. It's all one thing. V'ha'pu'ulot mishtanot. Their application is different, their outcome is different, but it's the same salt. Aval ha'inyan echad. So the Rabbeinu Bechaya, following the route of the Ramban, is emphasizing the oneness of the opposites. This is a duality. It's a polarity with salt. It's a paradox that's almost irreconcilable, just as fire is. Its power to sustain and provide flavor, and its power to destroy and lay waste. And it's the same property. It's the same salt. You don't change anything. The same salt does both. And it's the Ha'amek Dover Netziv who explains so beautifully what it's about. And he says, this teaches us the idea of Hashgacha Pratis, of Hashem's responding to each individual according to their actions. That's what Brit means. Brit means there's a deal, I have a deal. It doesn't mean I will always... Brit is not unconditional. Brit is condition. Brit is if you do this, I'll protect you, and if you do that, I won't. Or I'll punish you. But if you want to eat salt, it's terrible. And it corrodes things. And yet it sweetens the food. You've got to understand that's nature. Dark and light are the same. If you've got a lot of light, there's light. If you turn the light down, it gets dimmer and dimmer, and then it gets dark, and you take the light away completely, and it's dark. It's a spectrum. Light and darkness are not two different things. It's one thing. It's light. Depending on how much light you apply to it, you'll decide whether you've got light or darkness. And that's the same with all of nature. Good and bad is the same. It's not there's good and there's bad. There's good and there's evil. Good and evil is one spectrum. It depends how much light you cast on it as to where on the spectrum you are. וקבע הקדוש ברוך הוא בעולמו בזה האופן כדי שיגיע ההשגחה העליונה לפי המעשה הטוב. שהרי אם היה הטוב בהחלט רע, if there was only evil, or there was only good, the world would be static. The Rebbeinu Shem wouldn't have the sliding scale to apply to the world. And that's what din and rachamim is. Remember, salt represents the balancing, the unification of din and rachamim. The same as the same salt has within it corrosion and flavor, so the midah of tiferet, which is the combination of it all, has the midah of din and rachamim, justice and mercy. And it's not that there's such a thing as justice and there's mercy. There's a God of justice, there's a God of mercy. No, it's the same Rebbeinu Shalom. Hashem Elokim. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. Hashem is the God of mercy. Elokeinu is the God of justice. It's the same Hashem. Hashem Echad. It's one. Like the salt is one. It's one. It's just a sliding scale. Whether you experience din or you experience rachamim depends on your relationship with Hashem at that given time. And your job is to manage the spectrum, to make sure that you're on the correct side of the spectrum. Just as you manage how much salt to put in the food and how much flame to apply to the food. Din and rachamim are processes. It processes the human being. And just as rachamim processes us positively, so din also processes us positively. To be punished when we do wrong is part of doing good. And this is what the world is struggling with at the moment. What we're seeing is a conflict between the values of the Torah and the values of other religions of the world and of no religions of the world. Because if you look at the situation in Israel, in the Middle East, just through the eyes of rachamim, mercy, it's all about mercy. So the question is, who should you be merciful to? Well, who's getting hammered at the moment? On October the 7th, we were merciful to Israel. On October the 8th, we finished with mercy to Israel. Now starts mercy to whoever's being hammered gets the mercy. And now the mercy requires destroying Israel because Israel is not merciful. So in the Christian light, and some interpretations of Christianity, we see it's not all over, but in some interpretations, everything is about love and mercy. And anybody who's being abused in their eyes, you don't look at the whole picture because that would be din, to say, but look what they did on October the 7th, and don't we have a right to defend ourselves? That's din. The ethical world doesn't think din. The ethical Western world thinks rachamim. The Muslims think only din, there's no rachamim. So they see Israel as an aggressor, so they go on October the 7th and they burn babies and they rape women. They do whatever they want. Din, there's no rachamim, there's no mercy. This ability to see din and rachamim as one spectrum, and our job is to decide where to put ourselves, how to hold this together, how much salt, how much flame, how much din, how much rachamim. How much are you allowed to destroy Gaza? How much are you allowed to punish the Gazans? That's din. There are halachot for that. And we have to abide by those halachot. And there's rachamim. Who's the rachamim for? The rachamim for the people who are Torah have been aggrieved. It's not for the Gazans in this case. It's for the Jewish people themselves. If you watch and you interpret what's happening in the world, understanding this principle of the Ramban and Rabbeinu Bechaya as explained by the Netziv, which emerges just so interestingly from the way the Baal HaMoreh sees the fire as and the salt as the same, meaning that salt has within the same product, within the same chemical, it has both destruction and it has sustenance and preservation. So Midat Tiferet, the way Hashem judges the world and the way we're meant to see the world, has to take into account the full spectrum of din and rachamim. And we're taking into account the full spectrum. We have to make judgments, not only judgments of actions of other people, but also judgments of ourselves, to be fair to ourselves, because that's what fairness is. Fairness means taking the full spectrum of din and rachamim and not getting stuck on either extreme at either one of the two poles.